The autumn rain fell steadily on the cobblestone streets of Birmingham's city centre as Ozzy Osbourne stepped out of his chauffeur-driven Mercedes on that grey October afternoon in 2008. The droplets created intricate patterns on the windscreen as his driver, Marcus, waited patiently behind the wheel, accustomed to these spontaneous stops during Ozzy's increasingly rare visits to his hometown. Ozzy was between tour dates, taking advantage of a brief break in his Black Rain tour schedule to handle some personal business and visit family members he rarely got to see during his hectic international commitments. The contrast between his current life and these familiar streets never failed to strike him with almost physical force. Here he was, one of the world's most recognizable rock stars, worth millions of pounds, with homes in Beverly Hills and Buckinghamshire, walking through the same neighborhoods where he'd grown up as just another working-class kid with big dreams, a severe stutter, and very little hope of escaping the cycle of factory work that had defined his family for generations. Birmingham had changed dramatically since his childhood in the 1950s and 60s, transformed by urban renewal projects, economic shifts, and the inevitable march of progress. The old industrial landscape that had shaped his youth, the smoking chimneys, the constant noise of machinery, the smell of coal and metal that had permeated everything, had largely disappeared, replaced by shopping centres, office buildings, and modern housing developments. Yet certain corners still held echoes of the boy he used to be, fragments of a working-class past that refused to be completely erased. The old terraced houses where his family had lived in cramped but loving quarters, the corner shops where he'd spent his precious pocket money on sherbet dabs and penny sweets, the schools where he'd struggled with undiagnosed dyslexia and endured relentless bullying for his stutter and awkward demeanour. They were all still there, weathered by decades of wind and rain but stubbornly persistent, like old soldiers refusing to surrender to time. As he walked down Corporation Street, one of the main thoroughfares he remembered from his youth, his collar turned up against the persistent drizzle that seemed to be Birmingham's perpetual weather, something caught his attention in his peripheral vision. Huddled in the doorway of a closed electronics shop, wrapped in what appeared to be an old sleeping bag, held together with duct tape, and surrounded by a few meager possessions packed into plastic bags, was a figure that made Ozzy stop dead in his tracks. If you're finding this story meaningful so far, please consider leaving a like to show your support for stories about friendship, compassion, and the power of human connection. Despite the weathered face marked by years of hard living, the unkempt beard streaked with grey, and the obvious signs of someone who had been surviving on the streets for an extended period, there was something unmistakably familiar about the man. The shape of his eyes, the way he held his shoulders, even the manner in which he looked up at passers-by. It all triggered a flood of childhood memories that hit Ozzy like a physical blow. "Jimmy?" Ozzy said softly, his voice barely audible above the sound of traffic and pedestrians, hardly believing his own eyes. "Jimmy Morrison." The man looked up with eyes that had clearly seen far too much hardship, but still held a spark of intelligence and humour that Ozzy recognized immediately. Jimmy Morrison, not the famous American rock singer who had died decades earlier, but a lad from Aston who had been Ozzy's best mate during their primary school years at Prince Albert Road School. They had been virtually inseparable as children, two working-class boys finding solidarity in their shared struggles, getting into innocent trouble together, sharing dreams of escape from their circumstances, and supporting each other through the daily challenges of growing up poor in industrial Birmingham. "Bloody hell," Jimmy said slowly, his voice raspy from years of smoking cheap cigarettes and the effects of sleeping rough in all weather conditions. "John Michael Osbourne, is that really you? Or am I having another one of my episodes?" Jimmy was quite possibly the only person left in the world who still called him by his full birth name, a reminder of who he'd been before the fame, before the Black Sabbath years, before the Prince of Darkness persona, before the world knew him as anything other than a skinny, insecure kid from Aston, with a pronounced stutter and dreams that seemed impossibly large for someone from his background. Ozzy crouched down beside his old friend, completely ignoring the curious stares of passers-by who were beginning to recognize him, despite his casual clothes and low-key demeanor. Several people had already pulled out mobile phones, but something about the gravity of the moment seemed to discourage them from taking pictures. "Jimmy, what the hell happened, mate? How did you end up here like this?" The story that emerged over the next hour and a half as they sat together in that doorway while Ozzy's security team waited patiently nearby and his driver kept the car running, was one of gradual decline rather than dramatic catastrophe. It was a story that could have been told by thousands of working-class men of their generation who hadn't had the extraordinary luck or talent to escape their circumstances. After leaving school at 16 with virtually no qualifications, a common path for boys from their neighborhood in the 1960s, Jimmy had found work in one of Birmingham's numerous factories, just as most lads in their area were expected to do. The work was hard, repetitive, and poorly paid, but it was steady employment that allowed him to imagine building a life. He'd married his childhood sweetheart Susan when they were both 20, and they'd had 2 children, a boy and a girl who were now adults somewhere in the world, their exact whereabouts unknown to their father. For nearly 15 years, Jimmy had seemed to be building a stable if modest life. He'd worked his way up to supervisor level at the factory, earning enough to rent a small house in a decent neighborhood. His children had done well in school, and Susan had worked part-time in a local shop to supplement their income. They'd taken holidays to Blackpool, owned a small car, and even talked about eventually buying their own house. But when the economic changes of the 1980s swept through Britain's industrial heartland like a hurricane, Jimmy's carefully constructed life began to crumble. The factory where he'd worked for nearly 2 decades closed permanently, moving its operations to countries where labor was cheaper and regulations were less stringent. Jimmy found himself unemployed at 35, with few transferable skills and little hope of finding comparable employment. "The thing is, John," Jimmy said, using Ozzy's real name with the casual familiarity of someone who had known him since they were 7 years old, "I never had your talent, did I? You always had that voice, that something special that made people stop and listen. Even when we were kids, you had this presence about you. I was just ordinary. And when everything fell apart, I didn't know how to put it back together." The unemployment had lasted months, then years. The savings Jimmy and Susan had accumulated were quickly depleted. The marriage, which had been built on shared dreams and mutual support, began to crumble under the constant pressure of financial stress and Jimmy's growing sense of failure as a provider. Susan had tried to hold the family together, taking on additional work and encouraging Jimmy to retrain for new skills. But his confidence had been shattered along with his employment prospects. Jimmy had turned to alcohol as a way of coping with his feelings of inadequacy and despair. What had started as a few pints at the pub to escape his problems had gradually escalated into serious drinking that affected every aspect of his life. Susan had ultimately made the painful decision to take the children and move in with her sister in another city, hoping that distance might give Jimmy the wake-up call he needed to address his problems. Instead, Jimmy's life had spiraled further downward. Without his family to anchor him, he'd lost what little motivation he had left to rebuild his life. A series of temporary jobs had come and gone, each one ending either because of his drinking or because his heart simply wasn't in the work. Mounting debts had led to eviction from his rented house, and Jimmy had found himself sleeping rough for the first time in his life. "That was nearly 6 years ago now," Jimmy continued, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had accepted circumstances that would have been unthinkable in his younger years. "Been living on the streets of Birmingham ever since, surviving on benefits when I can get them, charity when it's available, and the occasional odd job when someone's willing to take a chance on someone who looks like me." The years had been brutally unkind to Jimmy. His face bore the marks of prolonged exposure to harsh weather, inadequate nutrition, and the constant stress of survival on the streets. His clothes were worn and patched, and he carried the distinctive smell of someone who had limited access to washing facilities. Yet despite his obvious hardships, there was still something essentially dignified about him, a core of humanity that had survived even the worst circumstances. "I've seen you on the telly though," Jimmy continued with a wan smile that reminded Ozzy powerfully of the boy he'd known. "Always proud to tell people I knew you when we were kids. Used to say to anyone who'd listen, 'That's my mate John up there, singing his heart out to millions of people.' Of course, nobody ever believed me. Why would they? What would a homeless drunk know about Ozzy Osbourne?" Jimmy had indeed followed Ozzy's career from afar, watching his childhood friend's transformation from a working-class Birmingham lad into one of the world's most famous entertainers. He'd seen the Black Sabbath years, the solo career, the reality television shows, the various controversies and comebacks. Through all his own struggles, he'd taken a kind of vicarious pride in Ozzy's success, seeing it as proof that boys from their neighborhood could achieve extraordinary things. Sometimes, when things got really bad, when I was cold and hungry and wondering if I'd see another morning, I'd think about you and how far you'd come, Jimmy admitted. It gave me something to hold on to, knowing that someone who started where we started could end up where you ended up. It meant the world wasn't completely closed to people like us. Ozzy felt his heart breaking as he listened to his childhood friend's story. Here was someone who had been part of his earliest memories, who had shared his dreams and fears during those formative years when they were just two kids trying to make sense of a world that seemed stacked against them. Jimmy had been there during Ozzy's worst moments of self-doubt, offering friendship and support when it mattered most. Now he was reduced to sleeping in doorways while Ozzy lived in luxury around the world. The guilt was overwhelming, but Ozzy also felt a fierce determination rising within him. This was unacceptable. His oldest friend shouldn't be living like this, not while Ozzy had the resources to change everything with a single phone call. "Jimmy, you can't stay here," Ozzy said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions and having them implemented immediately. "Not for another bloody night. I won't allow it. I should have found you years ago." What Ozzy did next would become one of the most generous and life-changing acts of kindness in rock and roll history, though he would insist for years afterward that it was simply what any decent person would do for an old friend. It wasn't charity in his mind. It was family looking after family. First, he called his personal assistant, Miranda, and arranged for Jimmy to be taken immediately to the Hyatt Regency Birmingham, one of the city's finest hotels. There, Jimmy would have access to a luxury suite where he could get properly cleaned up, have his first real meal in weeks, and sleep in a bed with clean sheets for the first time in months. But Ozzy made it clear to everyone involved that this was just the beginning of a much more comprehensive intervention. Over the following days, while Jimmy adjusted to being indoors and having regular meals, Ozzy worked behind the scenes to arrange a complete transformation of his friend's circumstances. He contacted the best private rehabilitation facilities in the country, eventually settling on a residential program in the Cotswolds that specialized in treating people with long-term alcohol dependency combined with homelessness-related trauma. The facility, Meadowbrook Recovery Center, was known for its holistic approach to addiction treatment, combining medical intervention with psychological counseling, life skills training, and gradual reintegration into society. Most importantly for Jimmy's case, they had experience working with people who had been homeless for extended periods and understood the unique challenges involved in helping someone rebuild their entire life from scratch. Ozzy paid for the entire 6-month treatment program out of his own pocket, ensuring that Jimmy received the best possible care without any financial pressure or concern about insurance coverage. But more importantly than the money, he visited regularly, providing the emotional support that Jimmy needed to believe he could actually rebuild his life after so many years of failure and disappointment. The visits were informal and natural, two old friends catching up on decades of separation. They would sit in the facility's garden or common room, talking about their childhood adventures, mutual friends from the old neighborhood, and their very different paths through life. For Jimmy, these visits were proof that someone still valued him as a human being, that his life had meaning beyond his current circumstances. "You know what the hardest part was?" Jimmy told Ozzy during one of these visits, about 3 months into his treatment. "It wasn't the cold or the hunger or even the danger of living on the streets. It was feeling invisible, like I didn't matter to anyone anymore, like I could disappear tomorrow and nobody would even notice." Ozzy's presence changed all of that. Suddenly, Jimmy had someone who cared about his progress, someone who believed in his ability to overcome his addiction and rebuild his life. The staff at Meadowbrook noted a significant improvement in Jimmy's motivation and engagement with the program after Ozzy's visits began. When Jimmy successfully completed his rehabilitation program, the first time he'd finished anything significant in years, Ozzy had another surprise waiting. He had quietly purchased a small but comfortable flat in Moseley, a pleasant neighborhood in South Birmingham, not far from where they'd grown up. The flat was furnished modestly but comfortably, with everything Jimmy would need to live independently. A proper bed, a kitchenette, a sitting area with a television, and most importantly, a sense of dignity and privacy that he hadn't experienced in years. The flat came with no strings attached and no time limit. Ozzy made it clear that Jimmy could live there for as long as he needed, rent-free, while he rebuilt his life. Additionally, Ozzy arranged for Jimmy to receive a monthly allowance that would cover his basic living expenses without being so generous as to remove all motivation for self-improvement. But perhaps the most thoughtful gesture was what Ozzy arranged regarding employment. Rather than simply providing handouts, which he knew would ultimately undermine Jimmy's self-respect, he created a position for his old friend within his charitable foundation, the Ozzy and Sharon Osbourne Foundation, which focused on helping disadvantaged youth and supporting various cancer research initiatives. Jimmy's role was to work with other people who had experienced homelessness or addiction, using his lived experience to help them navigate the complex process of rebuilding their lives. His job was to be a mentor, advocate, and practical guide for people who were going through experiences he understood intimately. The work gave Jimmy a sense of purpose that money alone couldn't provide, and his natural empathy and hard-won wisdom made him exceptionally effective in the role. "You saved my life, John," Jimmy told him during one of their regular meetings about 6 months after his release from Meadowbrook. "Not just by getting me off the streets, though that was obviously crucial. You saved my life by making me feel like I was worth saving, like I had something valuable to contribute to the world." The transformation in Jimmy over the following months was remarkable to witness. Clean and sober, with stable housing and meaningful work, he began to physically resemble the friend Ozzy remembered from their childhood. His posture straightened, his eyes regained their alertness and humor, and he began taking care of his appearance in ways that reflected renewed self-respect. More importantly, Jimmy began the difficult process of reconnecting with his estranged children, who were now adults with families of their own. The initial contacts were tentative and painful. His son Michael and daughter Sarah had essentially written off their father years earlier, assuming he was probably dead given his circumstances when they'd last seen him. Working with a family counselor provided through Ozzy's foundation, Jimmy gradually rebuilt relationships with his children. It was slow, difficult work that required him to acknowledge the pain his addiction had caused them, and to prove, through consistent actions, rather than words, that he had genuinely changed. The first time Jimmy's grandchildren, 2 beautiful girls he'd never met, came to visit him in his flat, was an emotional milestone that left both Jimmy and Ozzy in tears. "I never thought I'd have the chance to be a grandfather," Jimmy admitted. "I thought that part of my life was gone forever." Ozzy, characteristically, tried to downplay his role in Jimmy's transformation whenever anyone asked about it. "He did all the hard work," he would say, when journalists or friends inquired about his intervention. "I just gave him the chance to do it." Jimmy was always stronger than he knew. He just needed someone to remind him of that and provide the practical support to make change possible. But those close to the situation understood that Ozzy's intervention had been both comprehensive and deeply personal. It wasn't just about money, though the financial resources were obviously crucial. It was about treating Jimmy with dignity, respecting his autonomy while providing support, and maintaining their friendship as equals, despite their vastly different circumstances. The story of Ozzy's generosity toward his childhood friend spread gradually through Birmingham's tight-knit community and eventually reached the media, though Ozzy had made every effort to keep the details private. When journalists approached him about the situation, he was genuinely reluctant to discuss the specifics, feeling that publicizing charitable acts somehow diminished their value and turned personal kindness into public relations. "Jimmy's not a charity case," he explained in one rare interview about the situation with a Birmingham newspaper. "He's my oldest mate, someone who knew me before I was anyone special. You help your mates when they're in trouble. That's not charity, that's just being human. It's what friends do for each other." The reunion had a profound effect on Ozzy as well, though he was typically reluctant to analyze or discuss these personal impacts publicly. In Jimmy, he saw what his own life might have been like if music hadn't provided an escape route from the poverty and limited opportunities of their childhood neighborhood. It reminded him of how fortunate he had been, how many small coincidences and lucky breaks had contributed to his success, and how easily things could have gone differently. "It could have been me in that doorway," Ozzy reflected during a private conversation with Sharon. "If I hadn't been able to sing, if Tony Iommi hadn't needed a vocalist, if Black Sabbath hadn't happened when it did, any number of things could have changed everything." Jimmy's situation reminded me that success isn't just about talent or hard work. Luck plays a huge role, and when you're lucky, you have an obligation to help people who weren't as fortunate. The experience reinforced Ozzy's commitment to using his success responsibly and expanded his understanding of how celebrity and wealth could be leveraged to create meaningful change in individual lives. It also reconnected him with his roots in a way that was both humbling and inspiring. Jimmy's story became an inspiration to others facing similar struggles, both through his direct work with homeless individuals and through the wider publicity that eventually surrounded his transformation. Through his position with the Osbourne Foundation, he helped dozens of homeless individuals find housing and treatment for addiction. But his approach was always personal and empathetic, rather than institutional or bureaucratic. When someone's been where you've been, they can't lie to you, Jimmy would tell the people he was trying to help. I know every excuse, every rationalization, every reason you think you can't change your life. I use them all myself, but I also know it's possible to come back from anywhere if someone believes in you enough to give you a real chance and if you're willing to do the work. His success rate in helping people transition from homelessness to stable housing was remarkable, largely because of his ability to connect with people who had given up hope. He understood their circumstances not from textbooks or training programs, but from having lived through them himself. This authenticity made him incredibly effective as a counselor and advocate. The friendship between the two men, renewed after decades of separation, became one of the most important relationships in both their lives. Ozzy would make a point of visiting Jimmy whenever he was in Birmingham, and they would spend hours talking about their childhood, their shared memories, and their very different paths through life. In some ways, Jimmy kept me grounded in a way that nothing else could, Ozzy reflected years later. When you're successful, especially in the entertainment industry, it's easy to forget where you came from, to start believing your own publicity and thinking you're somehow special or different from regular people. But sitting with Jimmy, talking about the old days and the people we used to know, reminded me that underneath all the fame and success and public persona, I'm still just John from Aston. That's who Jimmy sees when he looks at me, and that perspective is incredibly valuable. The impact of Ozzy's intervention extended far beyond Jimmy's individual situation. The story, once it became public, inspired other celebrities to take more direct action in helping people from their past who had fallen on hard times. It also highlighted the ongoing issues of homelessness and addiction in British cities, leading to increased public awareness and support for relevant charities and government programs. Several other musicians, inspired by Ozzy's example, began their own initiatives to help homeless individuals, particularly focusing on people with addiction issues. The story demonstrated that celebrity wealth could be used for immediate, practical interventions that changed lives rather than just raising awareness or funding distant causes. Jimmy eventually became a recognized advocate for homeless rights, speaking at conferences and working with local government agencies to improve services for people living on the streets. His transformation from homeless addict to respected community worker became a powerful example of what was possible with the right combination of support, treatment, and genuine opportunity. He also became involved in policy discussions about homelessness, bringing a perspective that was often missing from official deliberations. His experiences had taught him which interventions were genuinely helpful and which were well-intentioned but ineffective, and his insights influenced several local government initiatives. The two friends established a tradition that they maintained for years. They would meet every Christmas Eve, usually at Jimmy's flat, where they would share a meal and reminisce about their childhood adventures in Birmingham. These annual meetings became sacred to both men, a time to reconnect with their shared history and reflect on the journey that had brought them to such different places. Success means nothing if you can't share it with the people who knew you before you were successful, Ozzy said during one of these Christmas visits. Jimmy reminds me of who I really am, underneath all the costume and theatre and public persona. That's worth more than any number of platinum albums or awards ceremonies. The tradition expanded over time to include Jimmy's children and grandchildren, creating a kind of extended family celebration that bridged the gap between Ozzy's celebrity world and Jimmy's rebuilt life. Sharon Osbourne became particularly fond of Jimmy, appreciating his down-to-earth nature and his obvious positive influence on her husband. Years later, when Jimmy passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68, Ozzy was devastated but also profoundly grateful for the years they had been able to spend together after their reunion. Jimmy had lived to see his grandchildren grow up, had rebuilt relationships with his adult children, and had made a meaningful contribution to his community through his work with homeless individuals. At Jimmy's funeral, which was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched through his charitable work, Ozzy delivered a eulogy that brought the entire congregation to tears. The church was packed with former homeless individuals whom Jimmy had helped, social workers who had collaborated with him, family members who had reconciled with him, and community leaders who had learned to value his insights and advocacy. "Jimmy Morrison was my first best friend and my last best friend," Ozzy said through his own tears, speaking from the heart rather than from prepared remarks. "He taught me that real friendship isn't about what you can do for each other when times are good. It's about being there when everything falls apart and refusing to give up on each other, no matter how dark things get." Jimmy fell down harder than most people ever have to fall, but he got back up with a dignity and grace that inspired everyone who knew him. He lost everything that most people think makes life worth living, but he found himself again and used that rediscovered strength to help other people find their own way back from despair. He was homeless, but he never lost his home in the hearts of people who knew his worth. He was forgotten by society, but he was never forgotten by the people who mattered. And in the end, he proved that it's never too late for a second chance, never too late to rebuild your life, never too late to make a difference in the world. The legacy of their renewed friendship lived on through the charitable foundation that continued Jimmy's work, helping homeless individuals transition back into stable housing and employment. A small plaque in the foundation's offices reads, "In memory of Jimmy Morrison, who proved that everyone deserves a second chance and that friendship can survive anything." Their story became a reminder that success and failure are often separated by nothing more than circumstance, opportunity, and luck. It proved that the bonds formed in childhood can survive even the most difficult challenges life can present, and that true friendship transcends wealth, fame, and social status. Most importantly, it demonstrated that everyone deserves a second chance, and that with the right support, belief from others, and personal determination, it's possible to overcome even the most challenging circumstances and rebuild a life worth living. The story of Ozzy and Jimmy became a testament to the power of human connection and the responsibility that comes with success to lift up those who haven't been as fortunate. In Birmingham, where both men had started their very different journeys, their story became part of local legend, proof that working-class kids could achieve extraordinary things, that friendship could survive any obstacle, and that it was possible to come back from anywhere if someone cared enough to extend a helping hand. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of friendship and second chances, please consider leaving a like. Sometimes, the most important thing we can do is remember where we came from and help those who haven't been as fortunate. True friendship means being there for each other through both success and struggle, and everyone deserves the chance to rebuild their life with dignity and hope.